This is my story for today. Before we start, hit the subscription button and like. The rain came down in relentless sheets, drowning the streets in a cold, suffocating darkness. The city had long since gone to sleep, save for the neon signs flickering over empty sidewalks and the occasional silhouette slipping between alleyways. It was the kind of night where the silence was heavier than the noise, where the air itself felt thick with something unseen. Daniel had driven through plenty of these nights before. A decade as a taxi driver had taught him that the world never truly rested. There was always someone running, hiding, or trying to escape something. Still, something about this particular night gnawed at him, a silent warning buried deep in his gut. Then he saw him. A lone figure stood at the edge of the road, illuminated for just a moment as Daniel's headlights swept over him. He wasn't just waiting, he was desperate. One arm shot into the air, waving frantically, while the other clutched a briefcase so tightly his fingers looked bone-white. His suit, though expensive, was soaked through, clinging to his frame like a second skin. Daniel hesitated. Picking up passengers this late always carried risks. Drunks, troublemakers, even the occasional con artist, he'd dealt with them all. But this man was different. The fear in his eyes wasn't the kind that came from a bad night out. It was something deeper, something raw. Against his better judgment, Daniel pulled over. The moment the back door opened, the man practically threw himself inside, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Water dripped from his clothes, pooling onto the seats. The air inside the cab shifted, growing heavy, charged with an energy Daniel couldn't place. Then, as he glanced at the rearview mirror, his stomach lurched. There was no reflection. The man was there, Daniel could see him, hear the shuddering breaths, smell the damp fabric of his suit. But in the mirror, where his image should have been, there was nothing. Just the dim glow of streetlights bouncing off the back seat. Daniel's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. He blinked, looked again. Still nothing. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind, each one more absurd than the last. He was overtired. It was an illusion. Maybe the rain had distorted the glass. But deep down, he knew none of those explanations fit. Something was very, very wrong. And then, as the taxi pulled away from the curb, something hit the trunk. A heavy, sickening thud. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He checked the mirror again, his pulse spiking. Nothing but darkness behind him. No movement. No one in sight. But the man in the back seat, his grip on the briefcase tightened. His breath hitched, just slightly, as if he had been expecting it. The city blurred past in streaks of wet light, but the road ahead suddenly felt endless. Daniel didn't know it yet, but this ride would be the last normal thing in his life. Because whatever was chasing them was just getting started. The taxi's tires cut through the rain-soaked pavement, each splash echoing in Daniel's ears like a distant warning. The city lights flickered against the windshield, distorted by water streaming down the glass. But inside the cab, the air was stifling, thick with something unseen. The man in the back seat sat stiffly, his breath shallow, his posture unnaturally rigid. Water dripped from his suit, the droplets rolling off the leather seats, leaving a dark stain beneath him. The briefcase remained locked in his grip, his fingers curled so tightly around the handle that they had begun to tremble. Daniel tried to ignore the crawling unease in his chest. He had seen his fair share of anxious passengers, businessmen after bad deals, cheating spouses racing home before they were caught, but none of them had ever looked like this. Then, without warning, the first thud hit the car. It was a dull, heavy impact, right against the trunk. Not debris. Not a pothole. Something solid. Something deliberate. Daniel's grip on the wheel tightened. He flicked his gaze to the mirror again. Still nothing. No reflection of the passenger. No movement outside. But the back of the car had shifted, as if whatever had struck it had enough force to leave a dent. Then came the second hit. Harder. Louder. The entire vehicle shuddered under the force. Daniel's breath hitched. His mind scrambled for an explanation, but his instincts had already made up their mind, this wasn't normal. And yet, the man in the back didn't react. Not in fear. Not in confusion. Instead, he held the briefcase even closer, his breath coming in fast, measured bursts. He knew. Daniel swallowed hard, the words forming on his tongue before he could stop them. Then, the passenger spasmed. It happened in an instant. 1 second he was motionless, and the next, his body jerked violently, his spine arching against the seat. His fingers twitched uncontrollably, his head snapping back as a low, guttural sound escaped his lips. The veins on his neck, Daniel saw them darken, pulsing like ink spreading through water. His skin turned ashen, the damp sheen of sweat on his forehead catching the dim glow of the streetlights. Then, silence. The man slumped forward, his breathing ceasing altogether. His body went limp, his arms falling to his sides, the briefcase slipping from his grip. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. Dead. The man was dead. His first instinct was to pull over. To get out. To call for help. But something held him in place. A deeper, primal part of him whispered a single, horrifying truth. Don't move. Don't breathe. Don't look away. And then, the impossible happened. The man's eyes snapped open. They weren't the same. The deep brown irises had vanished, replaced by an unnatural shade of silver, glowing faintly in the dim light. His pupils were gone entirely, his expression frozen between lifeless and something far worse. His body twitched, the veins along his hands pulsating as his fingers flexed, cracking at the joints. Then, as if controlled by something unseen, his lips parted. A single word escaped. And before Daniel could process it, the entire taxi was flooded with blinding light. The light was blinding, cutting through the rain like a blade. For a split second, Daniel thought it was lightning, an impossible burst of energy cracking through the storm. But then it moved. The glow flooded the taxi from behind, stretching long, unnatural shadows across the dashboard. The rearview mirror reflected only brightness, a violent white swallowing everything beyond the trunk. Then, the roar of an engine, deep, guttural, and too powerful to belong to any ordinary vehicle. Daniel's pulse spiked. He pressed his foot down hard, tires screeching as the taxi lurched forward. The streets were slick with water, the headlights of other cars barely visible through the storm. But whatever was behind him was getting closer. Fast. The passenger, still rigid in the back seat, showed no sign of distress. His glowing eyes remained fixed ahead, his breath slow, controlled. The veins on his hands had receded slightly, but his fingers twitched with some inner struggle. Then Daniel noticed the briefcase. It had spilled open when the man collapsed, its contents now visible. And what lay inside turned Daniel's blood cold. Rows of syringes, neatly arranged in foam casing, filled with a liquid that moved. It wasn't just a chemical solution, it pulsed, as if it had a heartbeat of its own. The substance shimmered with an eerie blue hue, shifting under the dim light of the cabin. Some of the vials were labeled, though the words were in a language Daniel couldn't recognize. Others bore only a biohazard symbol, stark black against sterile glass. This wasn't medicine. A fresh thud against the back of the taxi jolted Daniel back to reality. But this time, it wasn't just an impact, it was a gunshot. The back window shattered, shards of glass raining down over the seats. The wind howled through the opening, carrying the metallic scent of gunpowder. A second shot followed, barely missing the passenger's head as it embedded into the dashboard with a dull crack. Someone was trying to kill them. Daniel's instincts took over. He veered sharply into a side street, tires skidding as he dodged parked cars and abandoned crates. The pursuing vehicle followed, its massive frame barely fitting between the buildings. Then, the passenger moved. With a speed that defied logic, his hands shot forward, grabbing one of the syringes from the briefcase. No hesitation. No second thought. He plunged the needle into his own arm, depressing the plunger in one fluid motion. Daniel barely had time to register what was happening before the change began. The passenger's entire body went rigid, his muscles seizing as if struck by a live wire. His skin darkened again, but this time, it wasn't just his veins, it was spreading, an ink-like substance swirling beneath the surface. His breathing hitched, then steadied into something mechanical, controlled. Then he looked at Daniel. His glowing silver eyes bore into him, and for the first time, Daniel felt the weight of something ancient, something inhuman. Another gunshot rang out, snapping Daniel's attention back to the road. They were running out of time. The passenger exhaled, then spoke, his voice low, unnatural. And then he moved. One moment he was in the back seat, the next, he was gone, launching himself through the shattered rear window with impossible speed. Daniel barely had time to process it before the impact came. The pursuing vehicle, the black, monstrous machine that had been chasing them, lurched violently to the side. Metal screeched against metal. Sparks erupted as it slammed into a lamppost, its momentum sending it crashing through a storefront. For a brief, terrifying moment, silence returned. Daniel slowed the taxi, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His hands trembled against the wheel. Then, movement. In the distance, barely visible through the rain, a figure stood amidst the wreckage. The passenger. His suit was torn, his body still racked with whatever transformation he had triggered. But he was alive. And he was looking straight at Daniel. A silent warning. Then, in the blink of an eye, he disappeared into the night. The chase was over. But the nightmare had just begun. The silence that followed was suffocating. Daniel's hands were still locked around the wheel, his knuckles white, his pulse a frantic drum in his ears. Rain continued to hammer against the windshield, but it wasn't enough to drown out the echoes of what had just happened. The gunshots. The wreckage. The impossible way his passenger had moved, inhumanly fast, unnaturally strong. And now, he was gone. Daniel's breathing was uneven, shallow. He forced himself to move, to reach for the briefcase still lying open in the back seat. The vials inside trembled slightly with the movement of the car, the glowing liquid inside them shifting like something alive. Then the radio crackled. Static filled the cabin, distorting through the speakers. Daniel hadn't touched the dial. The transmission shouldn't have been there, he was certain he had turned the volume down earlier in the night. But now, something was breaking through the interference. A voice. Garbled. Almost robotic. Then, clarity. Cab 209, pull over immediately. Daniel's stomach dropped. His cab number. His foot hovered over the brake, but instinct screamed at him not to stop. He had just survived an attack. His passenger, whatever he had been, had left him alive for a reason. And now, someone else was calling him out by name. The voice returned, sharper this time. You are in possession of classified biological material. Exit the vehicle, hands visible. Classified biological material. The briefcase. The vials. Daniel swallowed hard. They weren't just after the passenger. They were after what he had left behind. His mind raced through his options. If they were law enforcement, why the guns? Why the pursuit? Why try to kill them before even identifying themselves? Nothing about this made sense. He gritted his teeth and made his choice. Slamming his foot down on the gas, he sped forward, cutting through the rain-slick streets, weaving between traffic. The city was waking up now, headlights flaring in the distance, pedestrians darting between intersections. He needed to lose them before they caught up. The radio crackled again, but this time, it wasn't a voice. It was something else. A signal. High-pitched. Piercing. His vision blurred for a split second, the sound drilling into his skull. He clenched his jaw, trying to shake it off, but the ringing only grew worse. His fingers twitched. His limbs felt sluggish. The briefcase, the glowing liquid, it all seemed to shift, pulling at his focus like a black hole. His thoughts weren't his own. Then, the headlights appeared. From a side street, a black SUV pulled into his path, cutting him off. There was no time to react, tires screeched as he swerved violently to the right, barely missing a head-on collision. The taxi's back end fishtailed, the wheels struggling for grip against the rain-soaked road. And then, impact. The world flipped. The taxi slammed into a barricade, the force of the crash sending it spinning. Glass shattered, metal groaned, and Daniel's body was thrown sideways. The seatbelt bit into his shoulder as the car skidded to a halt, the engine sputtering before going silent. A ringing in his ears. The scent of burning rubber. His body ached, but he was alive. Then, footsteps. Boots on wet pavement. Moving fast. Surrounding the car. Daniel's heart pounded. He forced himself to stay still, his head resting against the steering wheel. Through half-lidded eyes, he saw shapes moving outside, black-clad figures, weapons drawn. Their uniforms bore no insignia. No police markings. They weren't law enforcement. They were something else. Then the door was ripped open. Rough hands yanked him out, his body hitting the pavement with a force that sent stars exploding behind his eyes. The briefcase was snatched away before he could react, the contents checked, confirmed. Then, a voice. Smooth. Controlled. Secure him. A sharp prick against his neck. Cold spreading through his veins. And then, nothing. Consciousness returned slowly, like rising from deep water. Daniel's mind swam in fog, his body sluggish and unresponsive. The cold pressed against his skin, not from the rain, but from the sterile air of wherever he was. His fingers twitched against a smooth surface. Metal. A table? Then, the voices. Distant at first. Muffled. But as his senses sharpened, the words became clear. Unexpected deviation. Subject Omega-13 was neutralized prematurely. A pause. Then another voice, more measured. Not neutralized. It escaped. We have a problem. Daniel's pulse spiked. Subject Omega-13. Were they talking about the passenger? The glow in his eyes. The transformation. The way he moved. They hadn't been hunting a man. They had been hunting something else. Daniel forced his eyes open. The world around him was bathed in a stark white glow, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. He was in a small, windowless room, strapped to a steel table. Medical instruments lined the far wall, along with a bank of monitors flashing data he didn't understand. But what he did understand was the two figures standing just beyond his feet. Scientists. One was flipping through a tablet, the other adjusting a syringe filled with a familiar glowing liquid. Daniel's blood ran cold. Then, the one with the tablet spoke without looking up. You weren't supposed to be involved in this, Mr. Daniel. His breath hitched. They knew his name. The scientist finally glanced at him, adjusting his glasses. We've been watching you since the incident. Tracking your vitals. Scanning for abnormalities. He tapped the screen. So far, you're clean. But that could change. Daniel swallowed hard. His throat was dry. What was he rasped. The scientist smirked. Not what he was. What he was becoming. Daniel's mind reeled. The glowing eyes. The inhuman speed. The vials, this wasn't some underground drug trade. This was something worse. Experimentation. The second scientist, silent until now, finally spoke. Omega-13 was one of our prototypes. The compound in those vials was designed to accelerate human evolution. Enhance strength, perception, cognitive function. He paused. The results were unstable. Daniel didn't need an explanation. He had seen what that instability looked like. The scientist continued. We're fortunate it didn't reach full transformation before escape. That's why we need to ensure you weren't affected. Daniel's breath caught. This wasn't a medical check. This was an examination. They weren't sure if he had been exposed. And if he had. The scientist holding the syringe stepped forward. This will determine if the compound is in your system. Daniel's mind raced. If he let them test him and they found something, would they let him go? Or would they make sure he never left? The passenger, Omega-13, had known he wouldn't make it. That's why he had left Daniel alive. Not just to escape. But to leave a witness. A warning. Daniel tensed. He only had seconds to decide. As the needle approached his arm, his pulse steadied. And then, he moved. The straps snapped as if they were paper. The scientist gasped, stumbling back, but Daniel was already off the table. His body moved with a speed that wasn't his own, his vision sharpening, his muscles reacting faster than thought. Instinct. Something inside him had changed. The scientists yelled for security, but Daniel was already through the door. The alarm blared. Red lights flashed. He ran. Whatever they had done to him, whatever had transferred from that passenger. Daniel wasn't normal anymore. And he would never stop running.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.